It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator of the first panel on markets, policies and social systems, and that is David Nielson from the World Bank. David's title is, he's the lead agricultural services specialist at the World Bank. That seems to me not to do justice whatsoever to David's deep insights and commitments to the institutional landscape in Africa and the intersections between research, extension and education. So David, you are very welcome here to Australia. The chair is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle. It's really great to be here in Australia and very exciting to see Australia's increasing attention to African agriculture, and exciting to see the emergence of the Australian International Food Security Centre and the strategy which is being presented here today. And I think we've, in the past, well, I arrived 2 days ago, and we've already seen presentations which really, in which the value of the centre is already quite evident in the work that's being produced, and that's really great to see. Coming from the World Bank, having begun to make some good connections and partnerships with the Australian institutions, I came here. One of the partnerships I expected when I came here was between myself and my luggage, but that has not yet materialized, so I don't have a tie. But I think there's good progress on other partnerships. And partnerships is a very important word for us at the World Bank too. Our president and our vice president for Africa have emphasized to us, the staff of the World Bank, that in the past the bank thought of itself as a financing agency, a development agency that does financing. And later we began to describe ourselves as a knowledge bank. And these days we are told we should think of ourselves first of all as a development partner, as a partner with doing partnerships. And secondly, knowledge, and third, financing. And I think the emphasis on partnership in the strategy that we've heard about today is very welcome. We've also heard a lot about CAADP. I think CAADP has become, you cannot talk about supporting agriculture in Africa without having that as the framework and the starting point for the discussion. That's where I come from, that's very evident. Our World Bank president talks about CAADP. Rob and his colleagues tell me that Mr. Obama talks about CAADP too. So CAADP is the term that is the framework that everybody's using to think about African agriculture. Now I want to refer back, just before we introduce the speakers, to Monty Jones and his presentation. CAADP is about Africans working together to set their own agendas and their own plans and being able to take advantage of Africa's own resources, people and otherwise, to do better, as he put it in his presentation, to do better on agriculture planning than in the past, and to do better on agriculture policy than in the past, and to do better on building institutional capacity in agriculture than in the past. And I think, as he pointed out, some of the most important successes have really been, there have been important ones, and they have been clustered in the capacity building and in the planning, and not as much in the second one, in the policy area. I think there hasn't been as much satisfaction that we've achieved as much analytical work, and we haven't achieved policy decision-making processes that are as well grounded in evidence-based planning as we would like to see and as CAADP had aspired to achieve. And ministers of agriculture are meeting this week in Addis Ababa to talk about the future of CAADP. Monty introduced the Sustaining CAADP Momentum document. One of the most important elements or emphasis in that document is the need to really have the policy part come out much more strongly as we go forward in CAADP. So that's the topic of this panel, agriculture policy. I think in the strategy that's in front of us, it talks about aspiring to establish policy frameworks to improve income opportunities for small-scale producers across Africa. And that is the topic of this panel. Now, before introducing them, I'm just going to suggest that we're looking for contributions from the audience and from the panel for the Australian Centre on the topics of, well, what are the policy topics in African agriculture that really need the most attention? what can be done to make the policy decision-making processes more effective and more evidence-based, and also to reflect on what is the situation in terms of capacity in Africa to actually do that policy analysis and to lead and go through effective policymaking processes. I think those are the three areas that we're suggesting would be useful to give advice to the African Center in its formulation of its more detailed formulation of its plans going forward. So without saying any more, let me introduce the panel very quickly, and I'm not going to say a lot about each of them. There's information in the back of your packet. If you're not already aware of their many accomplishments, you can read there. We have 4 panelists today. The first to speak will be Dr. Karen Brooks, Director of Policies, Institutions, and Markets at IFPRI, and until quite recently, my boss at the World Bank. The second speaker will be Dr. Vivienne Anthony from the Syngenta Foundation, Senior Advisor at the Syngenta Foundation. The third speaker will be Professor Nick Vink, President of the Africa Association of Agricultural Economists and a professor at University of Stellenbosch. And finally, Dr. Lindiwe Sibanda, CEO of the Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Policy Analysis Network, or FANRPAN. So those are our 4 speakers in that order, and I'm going to ask Karen to start the discussion.
If I sit here, will the slides move, or do I have to go up there and, no, okay. Well, thank you, David, for the introduction. Thank you, our Australian hosts, for a very productive and extremely enjoyable event that we have here. And thank you in advance for the partnership and the good work that we all intend to do together. So I'm very pleased that I'm part of this discussion, and I'm also quite pleased that at this point in the day, we have turned to a discussion, a more detailed discussion of the policy dimensions of the work ahead of us. We have had mention of the policy issues at a number of points in the morning, but I think it's very good that we have this session set aside to give a bit of concentrated attention to the set of issues, particularly because we're approximately 5 years now into a period of substantial reinvestment of financial resources in African agriculture. Those resources have come from national governments, they've come from international agencies, they come from the private sector, they've come from farmers. They're coming from a number of sources at a time when resources are incredibly tight and incredibly hard to come by, and the cost, the alternative costs of those resources are very, very high. And so there's a tremendous need to show returns to those investments. And the early period of CAADP has been one which put a major emphasis on investment of financial resources. I think now there is an understanding that to get the return from those resources, it really is important to give attention to the policy issues that provide the foundation for the expected returns to the resources and to provide the impacts for agricultural growth, for poverty reduction, for nutrition, for the improved welfare of African farmers. So for all of those reasons, it's very good that we have the discussion this afternoon on policy issues. Now, I'm a very literal person. I was instructed to use 4 slides for the presentation, so I have used my 4 slides, and I want to use the first 3 to present some elements of the context which, to my mind, present both opportunities and challenges that are facing African agriculture now, and that provide a context in which policy issues are very important. And those of us in the research community can provide some real value added in assisting our African colleagues in understanding the policy choices, the challenges, and in developing options for policy choices and implementation. And so while there are a number of those points that one could focus on, I wanted to draw attention simply to 3. And so I will suggest that we turn to the first slide. Oh, I can do that. Sorry about that. Okay, and this is the one where I would like to call attention to what's happening imports with trade. Very recently as 2003, there was a surge in net imports where in the agricultural trade accounts, Africa turned from a net exporter of agricultural products to a net importer, and those imports have continued to climb since 2003. Now, this represents both a challenge. Obviously, when the net imports are going up, there are a number of dimensions of that that are not entirely desirable and that are a challenge. On the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity because it does show that the markets are there. The reason that these net imports are increasing is not because agricultural production is not keeping up with population. On the contrary, per capita agricultural production in Africa is growing at the same time that these net imports are growing. The reason the net imports are growing is because we have income growth, we have urbanization, and we have shifts in the diet that are moving the demand for agriculture and food products faster than supply can keep up. Now that means that this is a tremendous opportunity for African producers. The markets are there, they are close to home. It's not a situation where, if productivity increases, there will be great challenges on the marketing side. On the contrary, the markets are there. The question is, will African producers be in a position to capture those markets, or will those markets go to producers elsewhere in the world? And so I want to highlight that as one challenge, opportunity. It's one that has a fundamental policy dimension where there are policies that can be put in place that will assist African producers to move into those markets to capture them for their own income growth and for poverty reduction. So after the look at the trade, I want to turn to another one which we've also heard about this morning already, population growth. We know that Africa is a young continent. Population growth is moving so rapidly in Africa, and it will continue to do so for the period that's shown in this graph up until 2050. We see that there are very large cohorts of young Africans reaching the age when they are seeking employment. And for the foreseeable future, that green bar on the bottom shows us that most of those young Africans for the coming decades are going to be in rural areas. Now, we know from our discussions with African leaders, if you have a dialogue with ministers of finance and with ministers of agriculture, ministers of finance are tremendously concerned about employment opportunities for young Africans, and they think of it as jobs, and they tend to think, from my experience at least, many think in a kind of an urban context of the question of what kind of jobs will be available for young Africans. Ministers of agriculture, on the contrary, are thinking about what can we do to keep our young people interested in agriculture and to keep them from leaving agriculture. What this graph tells us, and what we know from the generation of jobs in other sectors of the economy, is that those young people are going to be in agriculture. So this dialogue between finance and agriculture about how to create opportunities for young people has to come together into a shared understanding that the future of Africa's rural young people, for the most part, is in agriculture. And that's a positive message, because this is a time when that agriculture can be very exciting, when it can give them opportunities for increased incomes, and when they can bring their energy, their creativity, their innovation, their eagerness to contribute to really pushing those productivity figures. So there's a lot that can be accomplished by the fact that there is a cohort of young Africans moving into agriculture, but there are major policy decisions and programmatic needs that will be necessary in order for the agriculture that they move into to be an exciting and productive and modern agriculture, and not the alternatives. So it's not necessarily a need for an entirely new set of programs. There is already a well-articulated development path for moving African agriculture forward through the CAADP programs and through the investment programs that most of the countries have gone through, developing their own variants of that. But from my experience, the development of those programs has not taken into account the demographics and ask the question, to what extent do these programs create the access to land, the access to capital, and the familiarity with the skills that the young people will need in order to move productively into agriculture. So we do need to take another look, I believe, at the policy issues related to the demography of Africa's agricultural future, and to assist African policymakers and leaders in bringing together this thinking about where are the jobs and what is the future of agriculture. It's the same question, and to some extent the answers are the same. So on to an issue that we have spoken about quite a bit this morning, which is the question of adoption of technology. Again, a significant challenge. We can see the challenge there. Just sort of jumping out at us from these figures is the conclusion that there has been quite a bit of release of new varieties. This is in the crop sector in Africa. And that the uptake of those varieties, with the detailed data up until 1998 in Africa, was significantly less than in other parts of the world. So the issue is not the absence of technology, it's really the issue of adoption. And that's why it's so very exciting and so rewarding to know that the Australian International Food Security Center has chosen exactly that space to move into, to address the question of how can we move from the development of the varieties to the adoption of the varieties for the improvement of agricultural performance. Now, when we look to the latest data, and these are preliminary and they're just coming out now, but it's based on an update of this assessment of adoption of technology. When we look at 2010, we see a significant increase, a movement there from 23% of share of area under modern varieties in 1998 to 35% in 2010. Now, that tells us that there are some very interesting lessons to learn there about, in a positive sense, about what moved that? What was it that allowed the adopters to move from 23% to 35% of area? But there are still some tremendous challenges there. Once we learn the answers to why did that move, then the question of generalizing that and assisting others to move so that those numbers move up much higher than they are now is, I think, another challenge that we can face generally, and as researchers, we can be of assistance to African policymakers. So those were the three, those were the three issues that I wanted to put before the group. Now, we do have a whole research agenda. The program that I lead within the CGIAR system is one that goes across the 15 centers and addresses a whole very broad array of policy issues. And I won't go through the whole list of activities that we have. I would simply say that within that very broad list, we do have the scope to focus on adoption of technology. I think that would be a very productive and very important area to come together where we can be a useful partner. We can look at some of these issues of programmatic design and enhancement of the programs to address the demography of Africa's young people. And then we have a whole complex of work on linking smallholders to markets, which would be quite relevant to the work of the center and the work of the other partners. And so I, with great enthusiasm, present our research agenda and say that it's ongoing, it's open, we are already in partnership with most of you in the room here, and we look forward to more partnership, and we also have opportunities to build new areas into the program as the needs arise. So with that, let me just close and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to say how much I look forward to bringing the resources of the program that I lead into our shared activities in the future.
Thank you very much, Karen. We'll now turn to Dr. Vivienne Anthony from Syngenta Foundation.
Okay, well, first firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank very much the ACR for the invitation for the Syngenta Foundation to participate in the conference. And for me personally, it's really a privilege and a pleasure, a real pleasure to be here, because I feel personally very committed to what you're trying to do here with the new centre. First of all, what I was going to try and do is really, and we've heard about it a couple of times, is about engagement with the private sector and partnerships. So I was going to try and introduce the topic for discussion around public-private partnerships and bringing research into practice, and how really PPPs can contribute to the mission of the centre, and particularly maybe drawing out some of the challenges and the opportunities that this might lie that you might want to consider. But all of this within a policy and market type framework. Firstly, maybe I should say this whole area of PPPs, catalysing and supporting PPPs, has a very high priority of the foundation. Because we fundamentally believe that they have the potential to innovate and to overcome barriers that smallholder farmers currently are facing. And what this means, what we believe in, is it's basically market-driven approaches. That's the way forward. And that really to get sustainable improvements for smallholders and to get food security, it's through markets that really create motivation and people's energy to do something differently. But this whole area is hugely challenging. And just to sort of define first, if I just start the slide, is partnerships, and particularly PPPs, it means different things to different people. So often people just talk about them when there's some sort of transaction between a public and a private sector party. And so that may be funding, partnership through funding, it may be technology donation, it may be contracts for services, but something that involves both players. But what I'm talking about and what the foundation is really working on is partnerships which involve, and what we're talking about here is partnerships that involve combining the complementary strengths of all the players. And that can be the private sector, the public sector, but also the voluntary sector as well. So, and what this is all about is producing benefits for smallholders where those individual parties can't achieve it on their own. All right, and that's the key thing, can't achieve it on their own. And that can be bringing R&D goods into practice. It can be really new market creation, input-output markets. So it's a whole arena there. And typically it involves risk. I mean, all of this is about risk and joint decision-making. So both parties having skin in the game. And looking at really the fundamentals of whether PPPs can be a success or not. There's one thing starting them, and I'll show you a little bit of data, but do they really work? Do they actually deliver something, or do they create a lot of frustration and an annoyance to everybody and actually not provide value at the end of the day, in spite of a lot of trying? And so what we've been doing is trying to really understand these better, and it's something we've been doing for a couple of years now. And I've personally been involved with trying to put a practitioner's guide together for people who do want to start to engage, particularly aimed at R&D, particularly for players in the public sector who are not so comfortable with trying to engage with the private sector. And that's all publicly available. But for me, it boils down to, if you want to really boil it down to one question about the partnership per se, and the question is do you really want a partnership? Or is it really you just want something that somebody's got? Because partnerships are about giving by everybody and modification of behavior and so forth. And there are two words that matter, I think, enormously, but they're things that, and I used to work in the private sector, that we don't talk about openly, but we all think about it privately, and that is trust and respect. And respect is something I think is absolutely a prerequisite for a successful PPP. Trust grows. It grows through people's behavior and actions. It's not a right, you earn it, in my experience, if it works well. But what I wanted to show you now is, just quickly, is really some analysis that's been going on, where we've tried to actually make awareness and transparency of what public-private partnerships are there around. And this is all available in a database. And we did an analysis over 10 years, which was, where are the PPPs? And when you look worldwide, there's about 200 we could find. I'm sure there's a lot more than that, but about 200 that you can get public information on. And in Africa, we're talking about Africa here specifically, is about 100. And when you look on the value chain here, productivity and markets, they're actually all the way along that chain. So they're on the left-hand side, an area that many of us know and love, which is in the R&D, particularly around genomic plant science, plant breeding. We heard recently, this is the breeding and adoption is a critical piece. Crop protection traits, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work that's going on there in Africa. You're all involved to some degree with that, I'm sure, but also about really nutrition improvement and fertilizers. But then going on and looking at the markets, there are things happening around seed certification, credit and loans, innovative things happening there. Inputs insurance, that's something the foundation does itself. Innovative input insurance, but there's no time to talk about it now. But also connectivity. I mean, the whole changing what's going on with mobile phones and connectivity. This will transform what we can do. And the whole aspect, and I'm going slightly off here, but the impact, everybody's interested in impact. If you can get feedback, not just information flow through phones, but coming back the other way, this is really the heartland of being able to establish whether your endeavors here and for the new centre actually are making a difference. But what I wanted to do, because a lot of this is conceptual and I'm not showing you much here, is really to talk about one example, to bring it to life, rather than talking concepts. And I'm picking one here, which is not actually from the foundation, but is one that seems very meaningful and is explicit in this particular occasion. And maybe you know about this. Certainly colleagues in Mozambique will probably know a lot more about it than me. But if we just look at the case of SAB Miller, the brewing company, and they announced this year about basically trying to bring quality, affordable beer that's produced from cassava as the starch base, but the cassava basically the material's not imported, but grown locally in the country by smallholders in remote rural communities. So this is a commercial enterprise trying to really work and look at whether the local resources can provide and create economic development for those farmers. And if you look at the players, and this is what makes it interesting, so yes, you've got a huge multinational beer company, but you've also got development by the Dutch Agricultural Development and Trading Company of a processing piece of equipment, which means that you can process the cassava locally, not transport it, that the cassava is grown by farmers, that you've got the FDC, that's an international organization, public organization that's delivering extension services, and you've got the Mozambique government that's actually moving the dial on the policy around tax that gets paid on the beer. And this has a safety and security thing too, because local brewing, actually high alcohol content from local brewing is a food safety issue. And what this has meant is already 1,500 smallholder farmers doing local production, tens of thousands of tons are expected, and it's going to move through. It's scalable, and that's a critical thing for all of the projects we're interested in, is how scalable is it? So that's just an example to show you that thinking out of the box can really make a difference. And sort of moving on, so what are the challenges? How do you do some of these things and how does policy matter? So something that the Foundation's been doing over the last couple of years with the IDRC, and Jean Lebel's here, with Professor Sarah Bertinger, who some of you know, who's an ag economist, who's based at Berkeley, and her NGO, which is the GATD, or Global Access to Technology for Development. We've been doing a consultation process. There was a big meeting held in Ottawa by IDRC in May, and the outcome of that is really what I wanted to show you next. And this was consultation between private, public, government people, clearly everyone involved in the countries and how you do these things. And the outcome of really what to do and some challenges, and I invite very much the centre to think, are there things here that could interest you, is really every one of these contracts is different. You can't come up with generalized models for these things. It's an arrangement by the people involved, and it takes effort. These things are not easy, and they take more time and more resources than usually people anticipate. But also, it needs to be a strategic partnership that has durability, not a tactical thing, because it takes time, particularly if you're doing research and development. The second thing is business cases. How do you get to equitable sharing, really equitable sharing here? And how do you share the risks? So really looking at how you generate business cases, how you help people put those together so they're meaningful and will work. Financial mechanisms and how you actually manage that process. One of the things here, and I'm going quickly now, is how companies need support as well to do out-of-the-box things. So how do you actually have money flows that encourage both the public and the private together? And if I get straight to the point, you know, governments putting money into companies, you know, that actually, how you do that, that's not a simple thing. So then on to governance and decision-making and how you do that. Intellectual property is a critical piece. Commercialization route, absolutely critical. And negotiating vehicles, and particularly negotiating at the farmer level, how that's done. So these are areas that really matter. Just one more thing around policy, which is, and we heard earlier, the G8 announcement for the Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, where governments, companies, and both when I say governments, African governments particularly, and the G8 governments, look at how they can work together to shift the policy dial. The commitments are huge. I mean, the opportunities here are big already, and this is just in the last couple of months. 45 companies, 66 companies have signed letters of intent. There's $3.5 billion on the table. 6 countries already now got frameworks to try and move their policies to engender these types of partnerships. And Grow Africa initiative is a window and is posting basically investment opportunities to do some of this. So the last slide is really just to say, if you're interested to access information that what we've been doing and contribute, and this is the biggest thing, is contribute to the knowledge base and invite very much the centre, the RDC, and everybody else who's here is to participate in this. It's an independent platform which contains the database. It's seeking case studies and best practices, also about having expert contacts that worked in this field, looking at the business cases, the impact tools, and the financial mechanisms. So really, I'd like to finish and just really invite you all to please contribute to this. You know, this is a huge community with a massive knowledge base and energy. So we'd love to work with you on this.
Okay, thank you, Vivienne. Let's turn next to Vink, Professor Nick Vink. Let's try to stick with our 10 minutes.
Okay. I've got to tell you that my experience in forums like this is that economists are usually in the majority, but I think in this case it's not the case. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I leave up to the audience to decide. What I thought I'd do would be to just look at the definition of food security just as a point of departure, and then make 2 or 3 comments around that, and then draw some conclusions about policy issues. We know that the definition has changed over time from one which looked purely at food availability, which really said that food security was a national level issue. And as soon as we started talking about access to food and nutrition, the emphasis shifted a little bit more to household and to individual and community food security. And that more recently, the issue of volatility has been added to the definition. And now it seems as if people are sort of trying to bring in the old issue of food preferences. So just on the last 2 ones, let me just say very quickly that bringing preferences into the food security definition I think, is a dangerous thing. Prince Anderson has published about this, and earlier this year at the IFPRI conference, he raised the issue as well. So without going into too much detail about it, I think the problem that one faces there is that you're never going to really be able to come to a firm conclusion about whether an individual or a household or a nation is food secure if we're going to take preferences into account as well, much as one wants to take them into account. So that's just a sort of by way of introduction. I think the issue of volatility is also an important one, but one again gets the feeling that it's brought in as a negative. In other words, when prices are volatile, then it's almost automatically true that people have become more food insecure. And I don't think that's true, because, of course, when prices are volatile, it creates opportunities for arbitrage, and we know that arbitrage is something which can increase economic welfare. We also know that the transmission of price volatility at the level of commodities is not automatic, and it's not 100%, that it doesn't go through on a one-on-one basis into retail prices. And so it sort of raises the whole issue, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later as well, of what happens between the production of the commodities and then the consumption of the food products, which come out at the end. So the nature of those transmission patterns are as important as the sort of levels of volatility in their own right. And then the third one is, again, people say that volatile prices make it more difficult for farmers to plan. Well, yes, but only partly, because farmers don't react only to prices, they react to profit margins. And profit margins are prices times quantities, both on the input and on the output side. And of course, what this puts them in a position to do, and this is an issue which has been especially in the agricultural economics literature since the 1930s at least, is it puts them in a position to manipulate quantities, and this is what non-economists call technology, right? Technological progress, trying to get more output out of a given number of inputs, or with the same, with fewer inputs producing the same amount of output. So again, volatility, I think it's important. It is an important component of the definition of food security, but one should not be just negative about it. And I think we need to look at it in context. But the sort of broader point that I want to look at is this sort of switch that when we started talking more about access to food and nutrition, that we sort of started focusing more and more on individuals and on households. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think we have to be careful that we don't lose the focus on a national, and in Africa very definitely on a regional level. Because Africa is made up of a lot of often very small countries, that regional thing is, I think, very important. So I sort of start off with the statement, which is that the nature of consumption, and I was very glad that Karen Brooks showed some of the numbers this morning, the nature of consumption, and this is and changes in consumption. So both the quantities of what people eat and the qualities, the attributes of what people eat, those are changing very rapidly, and they're also changing very rapidly across Africa. That's going to determine what gets produced, where it gets produced, why, how it's produced, and by whom it's going to be produced. This is important, I think, for at least three reasons. The first one is that when Africa goes into negotiating forums, whether these are trade forums or any other sort of multilateral forums, it's often been it's often been the case that Africa goes in as a sort of a disintegrated, a disempowered, a very sort of separate group of interests. And these interests are not, they're not sort of bound together by the economic realities on the ground, purely because, especially when we're talking about agricultural trade, it's such an intra-Africa trade, it's such a small proportion of the total that essentially, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that countries' interests are more with the partners that they do most of their trading with rather than with each other, because they hardly do any trade with each other. And I think that's going to change very rapidly. These patterns of trade are going to determine countries' interests far more in the future than what they have in the past. I think we need to start learning how to take that into account. So these sort of the agricultural futures kinds of initiatives that have becoming more and more prevalent these days, I would argue, are becoming more and more important. A little bit more controversially, I think, is that we've sort of heard the statement made quite a couple of times this morning that the small farmers are the future of Africa. Without sort of taking any kind of value position on that, I would argue that we no longer have that luxury of we're going to decide whether small farmers or large farmers are going to be the most important in the future. I think the market's going to decide that. Markets, we know there's no such thing as a free market. Markets are institutionally determined, but markets are also determined by the nature of the commodities that they're working with. If we're envisaging a future where the major consumption items, the items where consumption is growing the fastest, is poultry products, and that's true in Africa. It's dairy products, and that's true in Africa. And it's red meat, other meats, and fruit and vegetable products. If that's the future, then you can't argue this. You can't have the same argument about it's going to be the small farmers who are going to dominate this, as what you would if we're talking about sort of basic grain production dominating production in the future. It's not true. Just to give you an example, I mean, South Africa's fastest growing export commodity, agricultural export commodity into the African market at the moment is apples. The second fastest is wine. Now, these are products that traditionally one doesn't expect to see on the horizon. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we can't. If you're going to ignore large farms, let me give you a prediction: large farms won't go away. They're part of the future. They're part of the landscape in Africa, and they're not going to disappear. So we need to work out policies. We may want to balance. We may want to balance things in favor of small farmers. We may want to balance in different ways. But we need to work out what policies we need to put in place in order to achieve that, and how do we implement those policies. At the same time, just sort of a third point, and I'm not going to carry on for much longer, there's the argument about supermarkets and the expansion of supermarkets. Now, I've had a couple of discussions very recently with some people who said, they keep on with this argument that supermarkets are only 10% of Africa's food retail, and so for a couple of decades they're not going to be very important. Well, 5 years ago they were only 5%, and I can guarantee that in 10 years' time they're going to be a lot bigger. In 2003, when Weatherspoon and Redden did their research, there were 80 supermarkets that belonged to either ShopRite or Nakumatt, the Kenyan supermarket group. There were 80 supermarket outlets outside of South Africa and Kenya that came from those two groups. The most recent count, which I've done, is over 600, which means that they've been opening at the rate of one a week across the continent of Africa. And ShopRite now says that they're planning for the next 5 years, is they just as a group on their own, they'll be opening one outlet per week. And we all know that Walmart has now come into the African market with a bang, and that over the next 10, 15 years, you're going to see that's where the major expansion is going to come from. Supermarkets are successful because they manage supply chains better than anybody else. And so supply chains have to be a focus of the work that we do and of the policy work that we do, especially if you want to make the supply chains more accessible to small-scale producers. So issues like logistics management, getting the private sector involved, as we've just heard now, competition policy, not only within country but across regional trading arrangements, the harmonization of competition policies, post-harvest technologies, industrialization strategies. People argue often that Africa is not industrialized. Well, I think if one looks at the industrial landscape in Africa, the thing that's really missing is not industries and factories in the sense that we normally think about them, but food processing. That to me is the biggest problem. And if you look again at where the investment is going now, it's massive into the food and beverage sector. The whole issue of trying to create rural non-farm employment opportunities, the location of production of these things, the location of the processing, the location of employment, all of these things are going to be determined by the way in which the supply chains operate, and so they have to form part of the agenda that we're working with. How do we go about doing it? Okay. How do we go about doing it? I've just given a list of, it's a partial list, but my sort of thoughts on policy topics that are important. What kind of capacities do we need? What sort of evidence-based policy processes do we need? I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think there's a lot of sort of nascent capacity. We've heard a lot about it this morning. And the partnerships between aid agencies, between the private sector, and between people who are working in Africa and trying to get these things going, those are the important ones. And I'll use my last 30 seconds just for an advertisement, right? And the kinds of things that I'm talking about when we talk about capacity would be, for example, the African Association of Agriculture Economists. We have our conference next year in September in Tunisia. I hope to see a lot of you people there. And these are the kinds of forums where we can share ideas and where Africans are in charge of the agenda and where we can do things which we think are important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Let's turn next to Lindiwe Sibanda. I know you'll be slightly more disciplined than the other three. Let's try to do 10 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I need your help. You can already see that the chairman is threatening me, and from where I'm sitting, I am worried. I see the gravy train is setting in. I see jet lag is setting in. So I've decided to start with my conclusions. And given the awesome opening session, it's a song. I'm not going to sing, as we were told that some people sing in 6 languages. The song is MMPP. That's the key message I'm asking you to take home. Policy is about the message, M. It's about the messenger, M. It's about the platforms, P. It's about the partnerships. MMPP, 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 MMPP. Now, just in case you think by listening to that short song you can now fall back and sleep, I also have just 4 slides. Ambassador, you asked the question, what communication tools are you using for the youth and women? Look out for slide number 4. There was a question, private sector, who are they? Look out for slide number 3 and 4. What do you leave behind and how do you measure success? Slide number 3. And finally, of the questions I remember, aren't you pushing off the poor as you intensify production? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure the title of my presentation has already sparked debate in your mind. But I enjoyed this morning listening to my colleagues make apologies about the green revolution. To say in Africa, it won't be exactly green, but I enjoyed my sister Agnes making a plea for the orphan crops, for the women crops. Now I want to put it across that the revolution for agriculture in Africa is going to be a rainbow one. Jimmy Smith articulated the milk, the meat, that is consumed at household level. We need to do something about it. The orphan crops, which we all grew up enjoying, the cassava, the yams, the pulses, that we can no longer buy from the supermarket. But when we go to our grandmothers, that's the first thing we jump for and say, this is food. What are we doing as African researchers to raise that voice and make sure that as we focus on improving productivity, we prioritize on what we know best as being nutritious, as being tradition, as being culture, because agriculture is about culture, after all. Africa is winning because it has a plan. And Professor Jones articulated the plan. But what's exciting is that we've been able to put a dollar sign to those investments. And what you see there is a summary from 20 investment plans, where clearly the priority for most African countries, 38%, is food and nutrition security and emergency preparedness. We couldn't be in a better location to talk about emergency preparedness today. 30% put priority on market access, competitiveness, and value addition. That's what we've been talking about this morning. Intensification comes up as number 3. But we cannot forget the others that appear in our investment plans as 5%, because they are the pillars that will make sure that Africa is food secure. We need science and technology. We need an enabling environment. We need institutional capacity. And therein lies my story. We need to equip the drivers who are going to drive Africa's rainbow revolution. It's the women, because 80% of the food that is consumed in Africa passes through the hands of a woman, one way or another. It's also the youth, because as we heard from Karen, Africa has this demographic dividend that it's not really adequately preparing for in terms of equipping them with skills within the agriculture value chain so that they get jobs. So I will not waste time, but go into focus on the household. I was excited this morning to see us all go back to our roots. We went through an era in the 1960s after independence where we all got excited and thought technology was the magic bullet that will help us to be food secure. Unfortunately, at that time, most of the planning was centrally driven from our governments with no other participants. We went through a phase in the 70s where we looked at integrated rural development. That had its own challenges. We then went into the 80s, 90s with farming systems research, where we were clear that we need to move out of research stations to where the people are, the people who need the technology. 2000 was a disturbing era, 1990-2000, with the economic structural adjustment programs, where we were told, do away with extension services, you're wasting resources, do away with research, there's already a lot of technologies on the shelves. Just make sure you bring in private sector. We looked everywhere for private sector, but they never came. But we forgot our own farmers, that they are the private sector, because they farm to feed their families, they farm to feed the fiscus, and they farm to feed the environment. So what we've done as FANRPAN is over the past 10 years, we've been trying to understand the dynamics at household level. And really farming systems is about understanding decision-making at household level. And thanks to Dennis Garrett this morning, who brought us back to our roots to say that is the starting point. And what we've done is really look at 3 countries. We have worked with about 10,000 communities, households, over a period of 6 years, where we go in and just look at the assets that the households have. The sad thing is that our households are asset poor. We cannot modernize farming. We cannot talk about intensification of agriculture if people don't have the basic tools for farming. What's happened to the tools? They've been sold so that people get basic income to finance. School fees is what most mothers told us is the priority. Health care. We in Southern Africa are in a region which is the epicenter of HIV and AIDS. And it's amazing how much in terms of resources is going into just keeping people alive. Now, what that means is, as we intensify, let's look at the human assets, the financial assets, the physical, the natural, and social assets, and try and recapitalize those households. Not everybody is going to be able to farm productively, hence the need to target. We've been able to come up with a tool which we call the FANRPAN Household Vulnerability Index, where we categorize households into 3. There is the low vulnerability household. As you can see our farmer of the year, Happy Shongwe from Swaziland, riding on a tractor that she bought. She used to be a recipient of FAO Food Aid and WFP, but she graduated and became a seed grower through the Ministry of Agriculture's help and FAO in helping her produce seeds, quality seeds. And now she's mobilized other farmers and she's packaging the seed, and the quality is at par with what is produced by international seed houses. We took her to Iowa a month ago, and she was a showcase because she's doing it. So those are the low vulnerable farmers. We need to have packages that target them and policies that target them, and we need to scale up those success stories. You have the high vulnerability cases. Those are your welfare cases. They will always be there. From our analysis, they make up about 4% of our rural communities. But we tend to blanket our interventions and treat everybody who is rural as one, and assume that every technology on the shelf can be picked up. So we need to target. We can only target if we measure what we have. We can only improve if we benchmark what is happening. So we need researchers that can measure, quantify, and do the modeling that's required. The next thing is the institutions. We talk about partnerships. We talk about partnering with African institutions. But do we really know their capacity? At FANRPAN, we've come up with a framework that looks at 6 components within an institution: the governance and leadership, operations management, human resources, financial management systems, program and service delivery ability, and external relations and policy advocacy capacity of the institutions. We have 16 offices in Africa, and we've assessed the capacity of our coordinating offices. Now, what comes up as needs for capacity development is knowledge management as high priority, resource mobilization, both human and financial, and just visioning. Most of our energy is spent on planning for today, and yet 10 years, 20 years' time, we are not clear how we are going to meet the challenges. So our institutions are saying this is where they need partnerships that can leave them better off. And to us, partnerships is not about extractive relationships. It's about changing me so that I'm better off than where you found me. Finally, the policy arena in Africa is messy. Just to confuse you, these are the players and this is the relationship, the mess that we are in. Who advises our ministers? Where do you meet them to equip them with the research evidence that you're carrying? Let's find the right messengers for our message. As researchers, the majority are not the best messengers for the message. Equip the media, train the journalists to carry a message, train the women. In FANRPAN, we have used theater for policy advocacy, and I've got a publication here. And really, through theater, when our women are coupled with researchers, they can package the messages into song, which mobilizes a constituency from the highest level at national level to come to the village, sit down, listen to the theater presentations. Then we hold them hostage to a dialogue on there is a problem of access to markets. How do we solve this? The researchers have told us the neighboring village has better services. Why not us? So let's find innovative platforms, innovative ways, traditional ways that we can use. The youth, we've got them at FANRPAN on Twitter. We've got them on active engagement. Currently, we've got journalists at COP18 who we just sent 6 from the region. Already 200 stories have been flighted on the FANRPAN website. Just making sure Africa is on top of the story. We're pushing for agriculture, and they are feeding their constituencies at home. Then finally, our governments. There is a tendency to sideline governments. You can't be in the policy business without putting government in the center. They need to be accompanied. They need help from researchers. And when they do a good job, give them credit. We recognize this year President Kikwete for the Kilima Kwanza. Previous year, it was the Queen Mother of Swaziland for the work she's doing with women. And before that, it was the late Bingwa Mutharika of Malawi for the voucher program. So we're saying the policy processes in Africa may not follow the linear process in developed countries, but let's find innovative ways of making sure The message is clear, well-researched. The messengers are the ones affected by the problem. The platforms for engagement are culturally appropriate, and the partnerships are value-added. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, speakers. John, I haven't managed to manage people as well as you did, but to the center, you have great partners here. They've given us even 30% more than we asked for, all of them.
Except your package.
But I think that those were very useful and interesting perspectives for this discussion. We have, Gabrielle, about 10 minutes, 5 minutes, only 5 minutes now for a few questions. I think we have a first question from the ambassador from Zimbabwe.
My question basically, and I don't know if it's going to be a question anymore because I think you have put it quite well, and this goes to Dr. Lindiwe Sibanda. How best do you think we can break the brick walls between the policymakers and researchers to ensure evidence-based policies? I know you've talked about your last slide in terms of that it's all over the place, everyone is talking to everybody, it's a complete mess. But maybe just an example on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more, and I think we're expecting a question from Professor Kim Anderson.
Thank you, Kim Anderson, ACR Commissioner. We've had a very rich set of ideas, I think, from this panel, and Karen started off by pointing out how much the poverty issue in the coming decade or two is going to predominantly depend on finding jobs for growing numbers of people in rural areas in particular. And Nick has given us a vision of great opportunities there as the middle income group grows their demand for various products that supermarkets come in, and value chains get transformed. So there do seem to be opportunities for meeting these challenges. My question is there something that one or two things that any panelist could suggest that the new centre here could focus on to try and bring out the lessons, good and bad, from both the policy reforms and institutional changes of recent times in various African countries that could help other countries to do better in this area?
Okay, let's take two more questions. Here's the first one.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is George Bradley from Kenya. My major interest is carrying out of research results. Before I say anything, let me say that I'm very, very happy to be in this forum. I'm privileged to have been in the university, to receive the university education here. And one of the things I used to challenge my professors, why don't you pay a little attention to Africa? So you can imagine how happy I am. The whole conference is focusing on Africa. At least my dream has come true. One thing I come at my point, because I've got many points, but only one. Bad policies lead to food insecurity in Africa. If you have good policies, you are guaranteed of food security. I give an example. In some countries, you try to find the price of a commodity, like maize, is announced at the beginning of the season. Come to near the harvesting, you hear the government statement, the prices have been reduced. Then the farmers are in completely disarray. That's a good one of the examples. I can give 1 million in the countries I've worked in Africa. So my question or my wish is that the panel could give us one or few indications. What do we need to do for the researchers, the basic researchers, to make an influence on the policies that are being involved in countries? Most of our African countries, the governments are the lead. You don't talk about private sector, probably except South Africa for that matter, which is exporting more to outside Africa than Africa because there are no systems within the countries to measure the qualities, etc. So I would have liked to hear a little bit more on the ways, except the last speaker, of course. She has brought quite very good points, but how do you think that the basic researchers could have an influence in policy formulation in a country? That is what we are missing. We got so much knowledge, but you only hear ministers in some countries announce, and it is as if there is no researcher there, or nobody knows anything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to stop the questions here. And two of the questions were really about how can research have an impact with policymakers. I think one of those was addressed to you, Lindiwe. And could I ask Karen also to respond to those questions? And the two of you could respond to Professor Anderson's question on lessons from what we've seen in the past and how can that advise what the center might focus on. So let's start with Lindiwe first.
Thank you. I'll address the two questions from Ambassador and the second question. How do we break the brick wall between policymakers and researchers? And how do we really hold our governments to account when they go off track? I think the main thing is that policy is about winners and losers. But the main role of the researchers is to avail the options and to have a platform where you communicate those options. Now, the best platform is a multi-stakeholder platform where you have the farmers, you have government, you have researchers, and you have the researchers, the farmers, the government, and private sector. And there, really, as researchers, you have to be proactive. Don't wait when government has made a mistake to accuse them. Be proactive, follow the development agenda and the debate, but have a regular platform where you build trust. You build trust with government that what you are producing as evidence is undiluted and you have no hidden agenda, but at the same time you are consistent with your message. And then you have the messengers, who are the farmers in the private sector, to argue from their own perspective. And government will not necessarily follow the recommendations, but you would have availed the options. And you can hold them to account to say, we told you, you chose one path, but the other options are still open. And we've created these dialogue platforms in 16 of the countries where we work. And we find that is key because it maintains the trust and the relationship between state and non-state actors.
Okay, thank you.
On the question of how can policy-oriented research be most relevant and be most effective, I think that we're still all learning about that, and I think we'll continue to learn as we get more experience in the areas. But my own view is that we've come from an older understanding where the researcher developed a research program with the understanding that this was an important issue, went through and did very good quality research, and then at the end of the research had a paragraph which said, these are the policy implications of my research, and sent it to the journal that was published, and there was an expectation that simply freeing that information into the public domain would have an impact, and in some cases it did. There have been some very influential pieces that came out of that process, but there has been a lot that has not actually been taken up using that process. And I think the way that we're thinking about it instead is to be much more sophisticated in understanding the political economy of agricultural policy, that it's not just good suggestions that move agricultural policies, but rather there's a very complicated dynamic there, which is fundamentally political. And the key challenge is to understand who are the agents within that process. When is there an opportunity to make a fundamentally useful contribution to policy dialogue? Where is an issue that really matters in terms of food security, agricultural development? Pick the ones that really matter. And then when one such opportunity has been revealed, then do a quick assessment of who are the agents in that process, who actually is going to be involved in making the decision. Make contact with them. It won't be only the government. There will be civil society organizations. There will be a number of players who will have a role, who will have agency in that process. The researchers don't necessarily do that. So figure out who the agents are and try to skew the outcome so that the information is most empowering for those who are going to be on the side that will lead to a solution or a decision which is favorable for food security and poverty reduction, and then understand what information those people need, and then design the research so that it gives them the information that they need in a timely manner, and be very sophisticated about how it's released. So that's a very different kind of approach to policy relevant research than simply doing the technical work and getting it published in journals. It looks rather, there may be some very interesting intellectual issues which would simply never be undertaken because they're not policy relevant at the time. And so we're trying to bring that different kind of thinking into the way we frame the agenda that we support under the CGIAR program on policies, institutions, and markets. And it is a bit of a new way of designing research. It will take us a little while to get it right, so we'll need lots of interaction and lots of guidance and help. So we welcome any of those who want to work with us to figure out how to do policy relevant research.
Okay, I sense that our session is coming to a close. Do we have 1 more minute for each of these?
Okay, I'm going to say 2 things, completely different, one of which I'm looking at about the economics, and it's an alternative suggestion to how to influence policy. And I'm speaking as a scientist now, and that is a suggestion for the scientists not to go directly to the policymakers per se, but to go to the economic planners that are looking at the resource management and advising the policymakers, and to ensure those people are equipped with what could be done scientifically, what should be done if resources are made available, and how that could change the future. That's one, economics. The second one is orphan crops. I've heard real food. Real food is these crops, and that will really grab, I think, people's hearts and minds and motivation. And to think through what's happening with orphan crops. If you look, the foundation, the consortium on orphan crops, they're going to have the genome sequenced of over 20, probably more, short width. That gives you resources in the science community to do something. How are you going to convert? That is an opportunity to convert that knowledge into something real through breeding. There's not enough breeding. I leave that for you to think about whether you want to try and make an endeavor there.
Okay, one last thought.
Okay. Just, sorry, I would argue, Kim, that I think it's a fantastic suggestion for a research project, because we don't know enough positive stories. We should also learn out of policy failures as well, of course. And I think we need to. There are successes across Africa. We need to know more about them, and we also need to look at places like Australia, the experiences that you've had here, and the Latin American countries, which we're looking to. So I think it's a great idea for policy research.
Okay, let's thank the panel.